The Neubauer Collegium for Culture and Society exists to promote path-breaking intellectual collaborations, and I shall talk about our future in a moment. But it's worth recognizing with gratitude that the very fact that we are here today is already the outcome of an extraordinary collaboration. This collaboration involves the generosity of our donors, the imaginative foresight of administrators, deans, provosts, president, the vision of our architects, the incredible stamina of the construction crew, the dedicated, thoughtful support of our administrative staff, and the inspiring creativity of the University of Chicago faculty. This whole ensemble is literally marvelous, and I think it is worth marveling at the ability of the modern research university to bring together the creative energies of so many for such a good purpose. But to be blunt, I think it takes the University of Chicago, with its traditions of innovation, of going with our hunches, of pursuing thoughts wherever they might lead, to establish such a special institution as the Neubauer Collegium. And I do not think this could happen anywhere else. Now let me say a word about collaboration in the humanities and the social sciences. This is not a fashion of the moment. It is a need that arises deep within thinking itself. Best understood, the humanities and social sciences are not the names of disciplines or areas of study. They are the names of different ways of thinking, of different habits of mind. And each can be said to be seeking to understand the human condition and the world we inhabit, but each approaches that project in a distinct manner. In the social sciences, there is an effort to be scientific in a way that is nevertheless respectful of our humanity, but that requires particular forms of rigor, of trying to keep the inquiring subject at a non-contaminating distance from the object of his or her inquiry. The emphasis is on formulating questions that allow themselves to be answered by gathering empirical data. And on the basis of the evidence, we may change our minds in all sorts of ways, we may formulate new policies and so on, but we're trying to do so on the basis of objective data. Now, in the humanities, by contrast, I think in the best cases, there is a wonderful convergence of subject and object of inquiry. Our creative thinking tends itself to shape the very thing we are thinking about, the human. And I think we can feel this come alive in a classroom whenever, for instance, philosophy lights up the classroom, or wherever a great literary critical essay brings a poem or a play to life, or, and this gets to this evening's lecture, whenever we are able to think about freedom freely. We achieve something wonderfully and remarkably human in the very activity of thinking what it means to be human. Now, that distinction drawn, it's time to undo it. For while there are importantly different postures of the mind, when it comes to an academic discipline, one posture may dominate, but there's often an undertow in the other direction. Our divisions of inquiry into disciplines will inevitably introduce some artificiality, even as it helps us clarify what we are thinking. And we should, I think, have a deep respect for the disciplines as they have evolved. But the questions that make it worth learning the methods and theories of a discipline transcend any particular discipline. And that is why it's always worth examining these principles from a pre-disciplinary point of view. And this is not at all a reaction against disciplinary research. It springs from the recognition that great disciplinary practitioners thrive in an environment of robust conversations from different points of view. And of course, disciplines, if they are to remain vibrant, need to be responsive to our emerging questions. And I think, let the disciplines follow the demands of our inquiries, not vice versa. Now, I think we can see this intellectual freedom at work in all the Neubauer Collegium projects, and we shall hear about some of them in a moment from our panelists. But to mention a few examples, the project on climate change is asking researchers throughout the humanities and social sciences to think on a different scale about the impact of the human on the planet, and to draw natural scientists into these collaborations. The Open Fields Project brings together anthropologists and professors of art from this university with curators at the Field Museum, the Art Institute, the Museum of Contemporary Art, along with young Native American artists, as well as tribal elders of indigenous peoples from around the United States, Canada, and Australia, to think together about the meaning and use of inherited material culture, to rethink the very idea of a natural history museum, to rethink how Native American artists might show their work in the context of these large collections of artifacts, and to rethink how Native peoples might reanimate the use of artifacts from their past. It's a collaboration that transcends not only disciplines, but institutions, peoples, and national boundaries. The Historical Semantics and Legal Interpretation Project has the potential to transform the way law is interpreted in this country. It brings legal scholars together with cutting-edge linguists to address a simple but difficult problem, that while the meanings of words and phrases change over time, the texts of laws, in particular the Constitution, does not. This project will bring hitherto unimaginable resources about words and terms have meant over the ages right into the judges' chambers. In short, the Neubauer Collegium aims to facilitate creative and collaborative forms of inquiry that are free to go wherever thinking needs to go. And we think that looking at a question from the point of view of another discipline or another habit of mind can open our eyes to things we were looking at all along, but not really seeing. We already support, and this is in terms of the numbers, 32 projects have been up and running for the past couple of years, and they draw on faculty from all over, all divisions, all schools within the university, and we have visiting fellows from around the world. On July 1st, 10 new projects are coming on board. We've been working very closely with them to get ready to go. We're also collaborating with the Logan Center for the Arts, the Gray Center for Arts and Inquiry, the Smart Museum, and the Court Theater to help the university think through the meaning of creative art in a modern research university. And to give just one example of this, in the autumn, the playwright David Auburn, the author of Proof, will join us as a visiting Neubauer Fellow. He's already picked out his office. In an office upstairs, he will write an original adaptation of Saul Bellows' The Adventures of Augie March, which will have a world premiere at the Court Theater, and there will be readings and tryouts right here in this building. And we are already in the planning stages of an event that will have a citywide collaboration on Saul Bellows' Chicago. And of course, we shall have the very first opening of an exhibition in our gallery across the way, a marvelous exhibition in a marvelous gallery opening this Thursday. I hope you can come to the panel discussion. So we've gotten off, I think, to just a stupendous start, but there's a lot more to do. Genuine collaborations require a level of trust and familiarity be built up between the collaborators, and they require an environment in which robust conversations can occur with ease. Now, this building provides a perfect environment for that. And although there is much to be proud of already, I think our visiting fellows program is really still in its infancy, and it needs a lot more work and it needs support. But we aim to make the Neubauer Collegium into the premier research destination in the humanities and social sciences for the best researchers from around the world. To give you a more intimate sense of how far we have come, though, let me introduce three of our Neubauer Collegium Fellows and ask them to come up. And I'll say Professor Anoop Milani of the Law School and the Medical School helps run the project Unpacking the Value of Health Insurance in India, fostering a dialogue about methodologies. And Professor Christine Mehring is the chair of the Art History Department and is the principal investigator of our Material Matters project. And Stephen Sawyer is an alumnus of this university. He now teaches at the American University in Paris, but he has been working as a visiting fellow at the Neubauer Collegium, and he collaborates on the State as History and Theory project. And I thought we would just begin with me asking the three of you, maybe just starting in this order, to spend each of you a few minutes to describe A, the project that you're doing, and B, how the Neubauer Collegium has helped you with this project. And why don't we start with you, Anoop?
Great, thank you. So, Jonathan, thank you very much for inviting me here to talk a little bit about our project. So the history of our project starts in 2008. In 2008, the government of India adopted its first national public health insurance system. It looked a lot like Medicaid in the United States. It was very ambitious. It was intended to cover the bottom quartile of the income distribution, provide them free health insurance, just like Medicaid in the US. A staggering 300 million people were supposed to be covered. And for a country like India, it's done an amazing job implementing this. By around 2012, it had already covered 150 million people. And I took a trip to India in 2010 just to get a sense of the change in the Indian landscape after this law was passed, and had conversations with government officials in the Department of Labor or Ministry of Labor that were running the program. And I said, you know, most countries that embark on something this ambitious usually continue, and you've just started with the bottom quartile. if you look at other countries, it looks like what you're going to end up doing if you follow their path is expanding this to cover the rest of your population. And it's a really big question of how you're going to do that given the limited tax base you have. And they agreed, and I said, taking a chance, I said, would you let me do an experiment, a big social experiment, to figure out what the costs and benefits are of expanding the program to cover the remaining 900 million people in the population? And much to my surprise, they said, yes, you can do that, and we'll collaborate with you. And so then I went on a multi-state tour trying to figure out which state governments will participate in this program. And we were able to launch a big experiment that involves about 55,000 subjects in South and Central India. As I said, it's a big randomized controlled experiment where the different arms get different types of policy options that the Indian government is thinking about pursuing going forward. And for those of you that were paying attention during the Affordable Care Act debate, it looks similar. So one of the options they're considering is something like Medicaid for All, just to extend their program to cover 900 million more people. Second option is to basically provide premium supports, much like what you see on the health insurance exchanges today. The third option is what we might call in the US a public option, which is just give people the option to buy into a government health insurance scheme. And so we have a randomized experiment with those 4 arms. We follow individuals that are given these 4 arms for about 3 years. So the program started in 2013. We're in the midst of it now. It should end by 2017 and should help give us answers on what the financial and health benefits of the program are and what the costs are. And it's very exciting to us as well because people in my field, so I'm an economist, I'm a lawyer, we don't get a lot of chances to do field experiments. So that was really cool. And it's one of the biggest social experiments, the second biggest health insurance experiment being done. So it's a lot of fun. But one of the things we found out as soon as we got to the field to ask people questions about, what are the, how do they think of their financial situation when they get sick, how would health insurance help, is that we spoke a different language than people in the field. And not just literally, figuratively, the way they thought about their financial status, the way they thought about health, the way they thought about healthcare is so different than the way we think about it in this country. And mainly the people that were participating were people from the United States, University of Chicago, Northwestern, Princeton, somebody from one of our our faculty that is now at UCL. And so we hit a stumbling block. Like, how do we translate the questions that we want to ask to this population? And this is where the Neubauer Collegium came in. So first David and now Jonathan encouraged us to go and reach out to individuals in other departments, and particularly the humanities, that can help us understand how to communicate with other cultures, to ask the sort of questions that we're interested, but in a language that they would understand. So they connected us with people like Judith Farquhar, Kostas Nakasis, and Dipesh Chakrabarty, people that I knew about but hadn't really gone out to talk to, and they encouraged us to talk to them, and it was fantastic. The insights that they had on how we communicate our questions was amazing. And what I thought was particularly amazing was they didn't just say, come work with us across the Midway. They said, look, let's find you the right medical anthropologist to work with wherever they may be in the world. And we ended up with a woman named Bonnie Kulkarni at Yale and a second person named Stefan X at University of Edinburgh. And they've been fantastic. They have taught us how to do interviews informally in a way that economists are not used to understand the way that we ought to ask questions in our economic surveys. And it's been transformative if you look at the way our surveys were before and what they are now. Now, there are a few other things I want to point out that I think that the Collegium did for us that was really important. The first one I already said, which is this is not just about interdisciplinary work at the University of Chicago, which is what I thought it was going in maybe. It was doing interdisciplinary work even if it crosses oceans. So we're working with, like I said, people in England. The second thing that was really amazing was it wasn't about us just learning from medical anthropologists about applying techniques from ethnography for improving economic surveys. It was a two-way dialogue. So one of the things that David did early on and said, why don't you talk to them about what it is, how you do things, and maybe there's something they can learn from what you're doing. And what we figured out was that that's true, that we could talk to them about the importance of sampling, survey design, sampling methodology, thinking about incorporating ideas like statistical power into the way that they do focus groups or one-on-one surveys. And that's been amazing. And I think that one of the nice things is we've seen immediate results. So this is a collaboration with the government. The government's always watching our study and figuring out what it is that we're learning. They ask us specific questions. And once they saw Bonnie and Stefan on board and the sorts of questions they were asking, they asked us even more about why hospitals participate, why are their enrollment rates so low, and it's been great. And they're one of the things that makes us really excited is because they're following, we really think it's not just about the papers that we publish, it's even the interim reports or the dialogue that we have in the interim that the government seems to be responding to. And so we're seeing that now. The RSBY program, one of the last thing they're really interested in now is that when they do their government enrollment, their enrollment rates, when they do it well, are 60%. 60% of the people they offer insurance take up the insurance. And this is a free insurance program. And only 60% are taking up. But somehow, with the help of Stefan and Vani, we were able to provide information about the program so that our enrollment rates are 80% or higher. And so now the state wants to know a little bit about, well, what exactly did we do? How did we change the dialogue to make it so that people were more accepting of this program? Which helps us understand what the impact of it is and how it should be molded going forward. So for that, thank you.
Absolutely. Christina.
Thank you for having me. So one of the driving passions that I have as an art historian is thinking about this car. Many of you have heard about it already. But to think about the meanings of materials in 20th century art. Probably many of you, when you go to a museum, have experienced this moment when you think, is this art? All these things that art can suddenly be made out of. This is really what is probably one of the most distinctive qualities of 20th century art and contemporary art. And we haven't thought very much about how these materials contribute to how we think about works of art, what they mean. And this is something that I've done in almost all of my work. So thinking about the historicity of dyed fabrics, period colors, the ways in which artists might work with materials like margarine and chocolate, and so forth. And because of that kind of passion, I've always been very interested in talking with and working with conservators, the people who figure out what to do when the mice have started eating the chocolate in a work of art, or whether we should dry clean a painting that is made out of dyed fabric or not. And so all of this really has sort of come to a high point in the work that I've been doing around what I call my car. It's a Cadillac from 1957, covered in about 20 tons of concrete, made by Wolf Fostel, a German artist. It's called Concrete Traffic, and you see it there in a parking lot at the former MCA on Ontario Street here in Chicago. Where Fostel made it in 1970. Shortly thereafter, it was given to the University of Chicago, where it was out on the Midway at Midway Studios for quite a while until it was put in storage. And then when I came to the university in 2007, I discovered that we had this work and visited it, because I knew from my work on post-war European art that it was a work of quite intense art historical significance for many reasons. One of them being that Fostel and this car is one of the very unusual and rare artifacts, one might say, of what is largely a performance art based movement. And performances kind of come and go, and you have nothing left over. Yet we have this car. It is also of great interest to me because the concrete that Fostel used, and of course the idea of using a car, parking it in a parking lot, very much opens this work up to questions of post-war urbanism, urban sprawl in the 1960s. And one of the things that fascinates me is that the concrete, of which you see a detail here, is very much a period compound with a sort of very large aggregate that is mixed, and we don't see that kind of concrete today anymore. It's also a work that I believe has great significance on campus, in our campus art collection. It is literally an embodiment of our dialogue and a relationship with the MCA, because it was gifted to us by the MCA. And it is a work of public art, when it was out on the Midway, and hopefully when it will come back, that really kind of embodies a kind of intellectual aesthetic engagement that doesn't just take place in the classroom or inside buildings, but actually also outside on the street as we walk by and encounter works of art there. And as many of you know, Henry Moore is probably one of the most visited sites on campus. Public art can really also be a destination on campus and a point of dialogue with our community. So when I visited this car, I was rather overwhelmed, I have to say. It was very exciting, but there were also very serious conservation problems. There were all sorts of patches that had been added to this, I-beams that had been added underneath to move it that were never removed. The concrete was spalling, things are falling off. And I stood there and thought, what can I possibly do? I felt kind of overwhelmed with a sense of responsibility, I should say, and who can possibly help? So I immediately thought of Christian Scheidemann, probably the most important conservator who works with these very unusual materials. He's the guy who actually works with the chocolate works that the mice have started eating and figures out whether to add more chocolate or whether to actually leave it as it is. So Christian came on through the Neubauer Collegium project called Material Matters as sort of my first and I thought only collaborator, but little did I know. I'll get to that in a second. Second component of my project is the No Longer Art exhibition that will open on Thursday across the hall, which constitutes an exhibition of art objects that are no longer art. They have been declared total losses by AXA Art Insurance. And have been salvaged by the artist named Elka Krajewska in her so-called Salvage Art Institute. And it's a way for me to, so looking at these materials and objects that are broken is another way of sort of thinking about materials and actually making materials particularly visible. You know, when something is broken, you can actually look inside in a way that art historians usually can't. And the big question when I first started talking with Elka and heard about her work was, where could one possibly show these kinds of objects? You can't put them in a museum because they're no longer art. And it's one of those moments, again, where the Neubauer comes in a perfect way. Third aspect of the project is another public sculpture in the university's campus art collection by Buki Schwartz. And you see it up there in the corner installed behind the Smart. Then it also went into storage. On a site on the southwest corner of campus, actually. I was very excited to learn about this work because one of the holds in the Smart Museum's collection is the sort of 60s period of minimalist sculpture. Artists that were working with a very large scale, with modular elements, with industrial materials. Very, very difficult to buy these days, very expensive. And so here it turned out we actually had art like this. However, these were actually two sculptures, and it turned out very quickly when I discovered these works. One is incomplete, the other one is complete. And Elka, the president of the Salvage Art Institute, really helped me kind of begin to think about how can we actually embrace, as an intellectually productive endeavor, thinking about a no longer complete sculpture alongside this complete sculpture. And how can we possibly think about the sculpture on this site and actually think about this site and the southwest corner in Cottage Grove and the midway, that is basically a kind of fenced-in site that at some point I'm sure we will build on. And how can this sculpture, this fragment, actually help us animate the site? So these were the sort of three components and driving questions. Sorry. Come back to the car for a second. So what did the Neubauer do here? So I think most importantly, it helped me and my many collaborators look at and research the art that in some ways has fallen through the cracks. Art that doesn't really have a category yet, that maybe even is no longer art. So it really has helped me push beyond the boundaries of what art is and where art is. And that is really, I think, in turn, where art is actually at its best, when it is intellectually challenging in very extreme ways, when it stretches our imagination, when we have it to engage specialists, but also a general public. And so that's one aspect. The art falling through the cracks, also quite literally. Much of this art that is in our public art collection, our campus art collection, has fallen through the cracks because it was given to the university before the Smart Museum was founded. So it never entered the Smart's collection and was taken care of for a long time very well by the university landscaper. And so gradually, we have now moved to a place, thanks to, in part, a provostial committee that we've had this last year on the public art collection, to a place where we now have a full-time conservator taking care of this collection and where we will very likely begin to move at least some of these objects into the Smarts collection. So thinking about things that don't have a category yet, that fall through the cracks, and then, of course, collaboration. So I mentioned I started out with Christian Scheidemann alone, and we now have a fourth workshop. We've had this series of workshops around the car at the end of this week, and I can't even count anymore how many people at this point are on the team, but it's been an ever-expansive team of largely actually non-academic specialists. And the flexibility that the Neubauer Collegium has afforded me with this grant and to go to whoever I might need to take care of this car has been absolutely fantastic. So we have, the archivist from the MCA, local specialist. We have a vintage Cadillac specialist who works for Richard Driehaus. This car collection. We have structural engineers who help us figure out how to make the structure stable. We have several concrete conservators who usually work on Chicago skyscrapers, but also on artworks made out of concrete, who are helping us, for example, extract the salt that was added to this concrete to make it cure faster on a cold January 16th, 1970 day in Chicago, that a German artist had no idea what it involved to cast concrete at that time of the year. And then lastly, I would say the Neubauer has really helped me or has given these research projects kind of university-wide visibility, and I might even say a kind of authority. In the sense that I have been so fortunate to be able to collaborate with, and people have been very willingly collaborating with me in all sorts of pockets of the university. So all the way from, some people are here, Bill Brown in the English department, to people in Dover in the Department of Visual Arts, even to the Institute for Molecular Engineering. Students, many, at this point almost generations of students, have been working on this car at various moments, researching it. PhD students, undergraduates. The Bocchi-Schwarz sculpture actually now is being researched in a class that I'm teaching on public art by someone who's majoring in math, and I'm very excited to see what he's going to find out about this modular structure. And it has also involved the staff of the university, which I usually really don't have much contact with. So I have really learned about the president's office, the provost's office. I have worked with people in facilities and planning, the Office of Civic Engagement. The Bocchi-Schwarz sculpture actually, the OCE, the Office of Civic Engagement, has been very, very important in helping us establish relationships to local schools and to businesses in the community to help us work on what we could possibly do with this site. So that has in some ways been a sort of probably unintended but very happy consequence of my project, is this sort of collaboration with various kinds of offices and staff at the university. And I should actually say, as someone who became chair in the middle of this project, it's probably the best training that I could have had to become a decent chair. And what a better marriage, really, in some ways, than to kind of have my research and my administrative work actually kind of feed on one another. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Stephen?
Thank you. Well, these are very tough acts to follow. So, but I'd like to just say thank you for this opportunity. It is an extraordinary building, and this is, the Collegium has been an extraordinary opportunity for us. When I say us, our project has been led by Elizabeth Clemens, who is here, the chair of the sociology department, and James Sparrow, who is now the master of the collegiate division of the social sciences. I was a visiting fellow last year, and the project is entitled "The State as History and Theory" now, as Charles de Gaulle once said, "vaste programme." But our idea was, in one sense, to come to terms with one kind of essential question, and that is, what will the democratic states of tomorrow look like? And it is our sort of, the precondition is to suggest it will build on the past, but it will no doubt not look the way they have looked over the last 200 years since their founding revolutions in the United States and France. And we asked this question at a sort of odd moment, okay? So at the same time that it seems that democracy has never been so widespread across the planet, it has also never been so much under attack. And you know, if you look on the shelves of the seminary co-op, but even the shelves of any library or bookstore, or even the headlines of the newspapers, one of the things that comes sort of that you immediately see is this sort of sense of a crisis of democracy. And I was just looking up some titles recently. I saw Post-Democracy. You have Undoing the Demos, a book on the crisis of democracy. As I was thinking about what I would say, came out last week in France. Counter-Democracy, Democracy Incorporated, and even a recent book entitled Hatred of Democracy. So we have this sort of sense of impending crisis, and at the same time, one could suggest that We had the wave of democratization in the 1970s and 1980s across Latin America. We had the wave of democratization in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Middle East has obviously been engaged in various modes of democratization, especially in the context of the Arab Spring. And then perhaps closer to home, we've had the Occupy movements. And in Europe, we had Indignados and everything that followed that, and then Maidan in the Ukraine. So there's this sort of sense that democracy represents, in one capacity, the future for a just social order, at the same time that we seem to be more aware of its crisis than ever. Now, obviously, this is the kind of project, this is the kind of question that one can only ask in collaboration. And it was our suggestion that, to some extent, one could only come to terms with this in a kind of interdisciplinary approach. And our sense was that, of course, democracy is a regime of discontent. That's obvious. But it is also perhaps the fact that this impending sense of crisis may also be tied to the insufficiency of our theories of the state. And so we suggested that the state, we sort of went back and we looked, we have historians, as I said, political theorists, sociologists, legal historians, political scientists, and philosophers involved in this project. And as we sort of looked back, we suggested, well, what are some of the dominant theories of the state that have gotten us to the point where we are today? And we, just in sort of schematically speaking, we could suggest there were three. We have the classic Tocquevillian argument of the relationship between state and civil society. And in that case, you have a sort of, the more associations you have, the more robust civil society you have, the less state you need, right? And vice versa. And of course, he famously used the United States as the model for one where you would have, a sort of weak state and a robust civil society. And then you had, of course, Marx, Karl Marx's theory, in which if you were to say it very schematically, you might suggest, well, the state is essentially an extractive body pulling out the resources of society, in many cases sending it upwards, redistributing it upwards, and then as a result, emerging as a kind of parasitic entity that really needs to be overthrown to achieve social justice. And then you had, of course, the famous third, perhaps great theory of the state, which would be captured by Max Weber and his famous theory of the state that was defined as what he called the monopoly on legitimate violence, in which was only possible because you had these sort of autonomous, rational bureaucrats sitting in, wearing ties, sitting in offices, doing things to people and sort of working rationally and autonomously. And it was our sort of initial assumption that that perhaps one of the reasons why we couldn't come to terms with the current impending sense of a crisis of democracy was because none of these particular theories were sufficient for thinking about the problem. And although they were powerful for much of the 19th and 20th century and certainly had extraordinary explanatory power, that's not the point, is that maybe they are less sufficient for thinking about the states of the 21st century. And so obviously this is something that could only be considered in the context of, now that Jonathan mentioned the sort of rise of disciplines. Of course, Tocqueville did not have a discipline per se. He was not a part of a history department or an anthropology department. And nor was Marx a member of an economics or a sociology department. And Weber was, of course, one of the founding fathers of the division of sociology in general. But as we move forward, it seems clear that no one person will be able to come to terms with what is the state. That's just too large of a question. The state is history and theory. But if you gather experts from Europe, from around the world, we've had over 20 interlocutors from England, from France, from New York to California, from Latin America. And if you start to think about this problem collaboratively, you can start to get some traction. But I would dare say that is the only way you will get traction on a question this large.
Thank you all. Thank you all. We just have a few minutes left, but let me, ask a general question. I'm just curious what a quick take would be on this. One of the things I've discovered about the Neubauer Collegium since I took over was that it's not just a funding agency that sort of gives the money away and hopes for the best. That the staff has been working very closely with the projects to help support them, both leading up to the project and afterwards. And I think we're all on a learning curve about like how can we best do that? And I also related to that is like what I know you haven't yet lived in the building because we're just moving in right this moment. But I mean, in terms of like the work you've done, what kind of help do you think the building will give to sort of facilitate the kinds of projects you're doing, and also just sort of teach us about what kind of support can we give that would help these projects? Any order is fine.
So for me, I think one of the greatest things and got my eyes all sparkly was when we took me up to the new AV room that allows for international video conferencing. One of the problems we have is that we have individuals that are in the project that are in the U.S., in England, in India, and in Japan. And so, being able to converse is very challenging. We try to do it over Skype, but it's very nice to actually have a room where we can do it and actually get close to feeling like we're in the same place. I think that's one of the most exciting things.
Great. Thanks.
Same thing for me, collaborators in Europe and also here. But maybe to add to that, not just to actually have the technology to have those conversations happen fluently and not to be reliant on Skype or encountering Skype breaking down, those kinds of things. But also for an art historian, so for example, we found the guy who made the car with Wolf Vostell, and we had several very long conversations with him on the phone. And we managed to record them, but not as well as we would have liked to. So to actually create a record of those conversations with the most advanced technology possible as you're engaging in this process of, these conversations constitute part of the research, right? Is very, very important, I think, and really wonderful. And then for me, of course, it's fantastic to have a gallery in the building. When I first applied for the project, there I think were vague plans maybe of having a gallery. Wasn't quite clear where this exhibition, as I said, would go. And to have a space that can accommodate art, but also really push beyond that. And I think a space that, because it is not a museum, pushes certain questions and will allow for a certain kind of work to really thrive. So one of the exhibitions that Jacob Proctor, the curator of the Neubauer Collegium, is working on for the fall, I believe, as in conjunction with the Chicago Architecture Biennial, is of an exhibition of the artist Katarina Burin, who works in part researching, one might say, perhaps fake architects, especially female architects, and gathers research and produces research about these architects. And so when you see that kind of a project, this kind of research gathered in a museum space, it becomes too much, too easily art. Whereas if it is in a space here that is actually a research institution, the kinds of work that she's producing, this may be research, gets a completely different kind of level of interest, I think. And so that space that is not necessarily just an art space, but also a research space, and that kind of confluence is really wonderful, I think.
I think the Quad Club won't be too happy about it because they're gonna spend less afternoons trying to hanging out in the Quad Club, because we quite frankly last year didn't have a space for these kinds of conversations. When you're working on a question like the state, it's sociology, it's political science, it's as I said, it's history, it's political theory. It touches on it's the law school, and obviously the university is organized around departments. That's fantastic. It's been essential for developing a notion of craft and what makes what has really pushed fields so far. But when you want to bring things back together, as you're saying, when you want to have the transdisciplinary driving the questions, and then we can go back. We can go back into our departments, but we need a place to come together to ask the question.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. I suppose the biggest pleasure I've got, an honor I have for the day, is to introduce Joe and Jeanette Neubauer, who are going to say a few words. And thank you very much.
this is a great day, and this is a great crowd of people in the audience because I know how interested and how many of you have participated in this. And it certainly is a great moment of satisfaction for Joe and myself, who, after all, have had many moments of great satisfaction at the University of Chicago. I want to start out by thanking everyone who has participated, but just to tell you that from our perspective, we have this smorgasbord of choices, things that we could possibly do, people that come to us with ideas and possibilities. And yet there is this magnetic field here at this university because of the leadership, because of the faculty, because of the staff, because of the way of approaching things, that somehow this convergence of things all comes together. Because conventional is not good enough, and even though people are very proud and often very invested in the traditions here, that is the moment when people sink into that comfort of the tradition is the chief indicator that it's time to get up and try something else. That moment of doing it how it always used to be done is the beginning of the descent, not the ascent. And so getting into this particular project was really interesting. Bob came to see us in Philadelphia, and he had that sort of twinkle in his eye, and they hadn't had their first vodkas, and I knew we were going to be in for a big evening. And he said, I want to talk to you about something. He says, and you're really going to like David. Of course, we'd already known Martha at that moment in time. And we talked, and all these discussions about how do you do this? How, because we don't speak scholars speak in Philadelphia. We just, But we are interested in what was before and what will happen after. And we are interested in things that are experiments that you can try, that you have a sense of what it is you're trying to achieve. You have a way to measure whether or not you have achieved it, then that you can quickly replicate it if it works, and then you can really scale it if it really works. And there are very, very few projects that take on all of those attributes. And of course, this seems to be well on its way to be one of those, which is thrilling for us. I read online, I'm addicted to the website, that within 2 years, one of your projects, which involved a gynecologist, an IT professional, and an English professor, has already been awarded a $1.5 million MacArthur grant for how those three have come together to use their disciplines to transform how people in, I think, the south side of Chicago think about health for women. I mean, how they get people who don't normally think they have options of seeing a doctor, finding a clinic, fixing their health outcomes to actually go and do it. And it's not the conventional way. It has to do with computer games and storytelling and all the kind of medical metrics that one would take to make sure that people that get their vaccines or their checkups or whatever it is. In 2 years, this is phenomenal. And this is just the beginning. And this is before the building was open. So who knows what's going to happen going forward. So I congratulate all of you. I'm addicted to what you're about to produce, and I look forward to your achievements.
So those of you who have been around us for a while know that my wife's in charge of words and I'm usually in charge of numbers. And it works pretty well most of the time. I want to congratulate everybody at the university for a wonderful achievement here. I used to, when I was younger, I didn't believe in buildings. I believed in ideas and I believed in in people, and most of our investments in the philanthropic side are about people and ideas. But every so often, buildings matter, and they're really important for what they symbolize. So when Bob talked to us about the Collegium, we, as Jeanette said, we became believers. And we believed in it because all my life I've worked on projects in the private sector that took more than one person to solve. They were just so big and so complex that you needed people from many, many disciplines to come and solve them. And the biggest problem was, how do you get people to work together? Because once you focus people on a particular project and you have a common baseline, then you get better solutions than individuals working on that in silos. So this became the same kind of thing here. Now we know that in the past, the physical science have worked together collaboratively. We know that, physicists from around the world get together, and physicians around the world get together, and mathematicians around the world get together. But humanists around the world don't get together to talk about humanistic issues. And when we found an opportunity to try this experiment, it became very, very intoxicating to us. And we said we will do it. But we said we have to have a framework, a physical structure that will encourage this to happen. And here at Chicago, experimentation is part of what the university does best. And so we had this building that we're celebrating the opening of today. There was a seminary, again, served its purpose in its time, and now it's going to get retooled to serve a different purpose. And as you walk around, I encourage those of you who have not walked around to really walk around. It's a different space than the spaces that you have seen before. It's an open space. We made it open by putting walls around, but the walls are glass walls. They're not permanent walls here. And we had a little discussion with, at the time, David and Francis, the architect, about where we would go and how far we would go. And David finally convinced us that we needed some enclosures, because he said, yes, the Americans might really go for it, but the Europeans will not. I'm not so sure that's quite true. But anyhow, we compromised at the end. And what you have here really is a laboratory where people from various disciplines come together to solve problems. The most amazing thing to me is that even teams that did not have their project accepted, that is, that had to form the project and formulate it and present it, continued to work kind of in skunk works without a lot of funding on the projects, hoping that that will get funded some other day, or they'll try and do the best they can without having funding. In a way, that's the essence of what a university should do overall, and that's, to me, what the University of Chicago does best. This is the true creation of knowledge for knowledge's sake. And fortunately for us involved in this university, it continues to do it. And unfortunately for the rest of humanity, very few universities continue to do it. So for us, for Jeanette and myself, and for our family foundation, we will continue to support that kind of inquiry, because we think it's very, very important to be able to do it. And it's particularly important in the humanities, even though I studied business when I was here, because unless you have the basis of humanistic thought and value systems, the rest of it doesn't work together. So I thank all of you really for allowing us the privilege of being able to participate in this. It's really a privilege in life to be able to think about these things, have wonderful collaborators like people at the university here, and then live long enough to see them actually materialize and work. So thank you all very much.